There was great activity in the next-door rooms. I asked the Swiss officer what was going on. "Oh, they're your colleagues from the other side who force-landed here during the day. I suppose you heard about today's big raid on the ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt. The boys left a lot of their tail feathers behind. Over 100 planes were shot down by the German fighters, and 9 force-landed here, some with shot-up engines, some with half a tail, and others with wounded aboard. Now they're celebrating the end of the war for them. They are to be interned in Switzerland." This was bitter news to me. Spend the rest of the war in Switzerland. Not on my life. First, we must get rid of the secret documents. After the good meal, we all felt a sudden urge to visit the lavatory, but the Swiss guard did not leave our sides and stood outside the door, which had to remain open. The 3 of us sat in the cabins, thinking how we could get rid of the documents. It was a long session, and the guard began to grow impatient. At a favourable moment, I took the papers from my knee pocket and flung them into the pan. A good pull on the chain, and they had disappeared forever. My 2 comrades must have done likewise, for we all left the place looking visibly relieved. In the meantime, the Americans had learnt of our presence and greeted us with the greatest cordiality. They slapped us on the back as though we were their best friends and offered us champagne. "You damned Messerschmitt guys! Why are you fighting for Hitler? Hitler kaputt! Germany kaputt! Everything kaputt!" We let the Americans go on talking, smoked their Chesterfields, and offered them our German cigarettes in exchange. They were rather surprised that we still had anything to smoke and accepted them eagerly, but after the first few puffs spat them out and called them stinking weeds. The strong Virginia tobacco made my head swim. I put out my cigarette and refused the offer of others. "Cigarette no good?" asked one of the captains. I laughed and replied, "Cigarette good, too good." The Yankees laughed uproariously. The Swiss officers were delighted that the pilots of the 2 warring nations should be on such good terms. A Swiss colonel soon appeared to interrogate us. We were taken separately into his office. The interrogation did not last long. The colonel asked, "From which airfield did you take off, and what unit do you belong to?" "Such questions are useless, Colonel," I replied. "You will receive no information from me or my crew. We want to get back to Germany as quickly as possible. Please be good enough to notify our military attaché." The colonel had presumably expected this reply, for he gave us permission to retire. From this moment onwards, we were not allowed to communicate with each other. The windows of our sleeping cells were barred, and a Swiss guard stood outside the door. Thoroughly exhausted, I slumped on my bed and was soon fast asleep. Next morning, I needed some time to take in my new surroundings. I did not see my crew all day. The necessary formalities were being carried out, and we were taken for a further interrogation. The Swiss were polite and correct, but I could not help feeling a trifle anxious. The second day passed in endless waiting. My companions knocked on the walls of their respective cells, and I devised a plan of escape, for I had no wish to remain in Switzerland. But on the 3rd day of our internment, we were taken by train under close guard to Bern. It was an agreeable surprise when we were given rooms in the Hotel Metropole, and the uniformed guards were replaced by a civilian called Fuchs. The German General Consul paid us a visit. We had to get out of our uniforms immediately, for in international Bern they might have given rise to unpleasant incidents. 3 night fighters in tattered Luftwaffe uniforms were taken to a store and emerged half an hour later as dapper civilians. The German consul paid for our uniforms and gave us a considerable sum of pocket money. We wandered round the city like harmless Swiss citizens. Everything that had long since disappeared in Germany was to be had in full measure in the shops. Cinemas, cabarets, dance halls and baths were open until late at night. Released from the tension of war and revived by the warm spring air, we enjoyed our liberty to the full. At this juncture, just as we were beginning to feel really well, our polite custodian Fuchs told us that within the next few days we were going to be exchanged for 3 Britishers. 3 British officers had escaped from a German prison camp in Italy and had asked for asylum in Switzerland. Nothing, therefore, prevented the exchange of 3 Germans for 3 of our enemies. At the end of May 1944, our convalescence in the golden Swiss cage came to an end. The German military attaché, the general consul, and a few German families saw us off at the station. As the train steamed out of the station and our friends were waving, Marley shouted out of the window, "Keep our rooms ready, we shall soon be back." Even the Swiss officers laughed and waved to us. Back in the homeland a new life begins, as the song says. Yes, with air raid warnings and blacked-out trains in the direction of Berlin. At the frontier, 10,000 Swiss cigarettes were handed to me as a present from the German consul. They would be a boon to the fellows in the squadron. In Berlin, the general officer commanding was waiting to hear our report. We were still in mufti. The German told us what had happened behind the scenes during our absence. I learnt the following. Hardly 9 hours after my forced landing in Zurich, the Gestapo appeared in Homburg, Altenburg and Breslau to interrogate our respective families. A short house search, various photos and letters impounded, the houses closed with an official seal, and an hour later our families were under arrest at Gestapo headquarters. Himmler had worked promptly and efficiently. On the same day, 2 men in civilian clothes with diplomatic passports left the capital for Zurich and Berne. One of them had been instructed to blow up my plane, and the other to put an end to my earthly existence with a well-aimed bullet. Our families were pestered with questions and squeezed dry as lemons. As nothing came of the interrogations, the officials grew cynical and locked them up. The food was disgusting, the cells filthy and stinking. There was no water. The staff of No. 1 Fighter Division soon heard of the events in Berlin. The telephone rang furiously, and Goering flew into a rage when he heard of Himmler's actions. The head of the secret police remained unmoved, but withdrew the orders for arrest and shooting. The SS Führer, who, disguised as a civilian, was to kill me, was stopped by an express telegram at the frontier. But the second man with orders to blow up the machine had already crossed the frontier. On the 3rd day of our internment, my C-9, ES blew up, under mysterious circumstances, on the airfield of Zurich-Dubendorf. On the 7th day of my internment, my family was released, after having given their word in writing that they would never breathe a word of what had happened. I was dumbfounded when I heard of this. I telephoned home immediately to console my parents. Next day we left Berlin and were flown to Haguenau in Alsace. The whole squadron was out to greet us. It was a happy reunion. When I finally produced the packets of cigarettes and distributed them, the mood was very high in our night fighter wing No. 6. We gossiped late into the night. I decided to pay a visit to my family in Homburg. It was a happy occasion, but I found them all very subdued. This sudden arrest and detention in a Gestapo gaol had upset their nerves, particularly since they were not told the reason for their arrest. Neither the party nor the government had considered it necessary to apologize for the mistake. Only the general officer commanding Berlin had expressed his regret for the behavior of the Gestapo. On my return to Haguenau, I took over my old flight. My regular radio operator, Feldwebel Grashoff, who had been recalled from leave on account of our trip to Switzerland, was delighted to see me back. That same evening, we took off to attack the RAF bombers who were raiding Frankfurt. At the beginning of June 1944, our transfer to Szombathely in Hungary came like a bolt from the blue. I had never heard the name before, but the German frontiers had changed so radically that we were no longer surprised at hearing Budapest called a German citadel, and our brothers and sisters in the Batschka referred to as citizens who have returned to the Great Reich. A fellow pilot maintained that Szombathely was a suburb of Vienna, about half an hour from Grinzing. Moreover, Hungary was the land of golden tokay, fiery paprika, and temperamental julishkas. What should we be hunting there at night? Although we knew nothing for certain, rumours sprang up like asparagus in spring rain. I gave no thought as to the why and wherefore, and looked forward to this trip to Hungary after my official visit to Switzerland. In Szombathely, Steinemange in German, we were under the CO, 1st Fighter Division, Oberst Handrich. He was just the type of CO we liked, a good sportsman, friendly and always on the side of his pilots. He initiated us into our new tasks, the protection of Vienna and Budapest against RAF raids from Italy, and combats with the night-flying partisan aircraft from the east. Whereas in the west, the night fighter arm had been broken up and gone over to free-for-all, the so-called wild boar, we were still flying here according to the old system. Days of waiting passed. There was nothing doing on those warm, clear Hungarian nights. Night after night we sat in our huts waiting for the fish to nibble at the bait. The mood of the pilots and the ground staff sank to zero. Some spoke of exile and others of convalescence. On one of these boring evenings, the CO brought us a model of the Mitchell, an American aircraft. We looked at this bird from all angles and shrugged our shoulders. "Yes, that's the crate in which the Russians will soon be paying us a visit," declared the CO. "The Mitchell is a twin-engined fighter of great quality, fast, easy to handle and heavily armed." On closer inspection, I noticed that it bore a surprising resemblance to our Do-217, which had recently been put into service as a night fighter. By chance, a night fighter squadron was stationed in Budapest, equipped with these aircraft. The CO switched off the light, lit a candle, and projected the shadow of the Mitchell onto the ceiling. It was exceedingly difficult to distinguish the American from the German. The wings were very much alike, both of them had small bodies and double tail units. Finally, the Mitchell had an engine stagger. In other words, the tail of the engines protruded over the wings. This was the only way of distinguishing between friend and foe. The night fighter CO from Budapest had already phoned us up in some anxiety. "So, gentlemen," said the CO, bringing his lecture to an end, "be careful of our brothers in the Dobso 217s, and don't fire until you're quite sure that you've recognised the type." The model of the Mitchell was passed round. Oberleutnant Sapp Kraft, an ambitious go-getter, stoutly maintained that any child could distinguish between the two machines. Another evening of waiting. The sultry summer air made the crews feel lazy. They sat outside in deck chairs, listening to a pep-talk speech from Goebbels. In the meantime, the veterans exchanged stories of the good old days in the West. "Yes, those were the days. Here in Hungary our crates are getting rusty." The hours passed. A storm piled up in the southeast. It was probably over Lake Balaton. From hearsay we knew that these summer thunderstorms in Hungary were very dangerous. Shortly before midnight the telephone rang. The adjutant casually took up the receiver, expecting a pointless conversation, but the crew was on its feet at once as he replied, "Yes, Herr Major, a machine reported presumably a partisan supply aircraft. One machine to be dispatched to Sector Cancer." The Cancer sector was in the direction of the thunderstorm. Who was to take off? Flying conditions were not good, for the storm clouds reached 24,000 feet with 80 meters ph winds. The choice fell on me. At 0.10 hours I took off with my crew, Oberfeldwebel Mahler and Feldwebel Grashoff, in the direction of Lake Balaton. I did not have to gain much height, for the reported machine was at 6,000 feet. The pallid moonlight lit up the outlines of the storm clouds. Lightning flashes rent this monster, turning the bank of clouds to an electric blue. I turned away to the west and flew round the bad weather in a wide circle. In this way I had delayed my entrance into the Cancer sector. Finally, we were in communication with the ground station. We were given orders to wait, and the arrival of another night fighter from Budapest, a Do-17, was reported. This might turn out to be amusing. "Well, boys, look out when we spot the enemy," I said to the crew, turning on a course southwest from Lake Balaton. A good hour passed. The partisan supply aircraft, in the meantime, must have landed with its weapons, ammunition, and radio apparatus, and would soon be on the way back. The storm clouds moved further westwards and closed my way to my own airfield. Then the ground station reported the enemy on the return flight. I was given the course and switched on my SN2. The ground station warned again, "Do 217 still in your sector?" What's the point of this lunacy? I asked myself, and hoped that we should not ram our friends. Grasshoff had now picked up the target on his radar and was leading me towards it. The enemy was flying at great speed and keeping a straight course. By its behaviour, it could be a Russian. At full throttle, we closed in, 500, 300, 100, and there he was. I dived and bobbed up below the opponent. His wings and body showed up very clearly against the sky. A Mitchell! Swiftly I loaded my guns and prepared for the attack. At that moment the ground station called again. "Friendly aircraft quite close to you." In great excitement the fighter directing officer called, "Achtung, Achtung, white thrush from Cancer. Be careful of friend. Do not shoot until you have recognized the enemy." This fellow down below was making me nervous. Could it be the Do-217? My wireless operator was also in doubt. It's obviously a Do-217 and not a Mitchell. The Russian wouldn't fly so nonchalantly in this neighbourhood. I peered out to try and recognize the two staggered engines. I saw them, so it was a Mitchell. My gunner Mahler had not the slightest doubt. "Have a go at him," he shouted. I was still not quite convinced. Rather than shoot down one of our own night fighters, I preferred to forego a kill. What was to be done? I gained height and got in formation position at a respectful distance from the plane. Who knows? The other crew must have spotted me by now, but it did nothing. I switched on my navigating lights, green, red, and white, and dipped my wings. It took no notice. Only when I fired 3 green stars did the other pilot go into a steep right-hand turn and disappear like lightning. Now I knew for certain that it was a Mitchell and streaked after it. But the pursuit was fruitless. The machine was too fast. Neither the ground station nor my sparker picked him up again. What on earth had he thought when I flew in formation with him with my navigating lights on? Possibly he thought that another supply plane was having a little game with him. Slightly irritated, I made for home. The storm lowered dangerously ahead of me. My only alternative was to land in Budapest, but I did not feel inclined to do this. I therefore decided to fly blind through the broad storm zone. My course led over Lake Balaton in the direction of Tobolka to Szombathely. My altitude of 6,000 feet ruled out any danger of crashing into the Kakony Hills. About 6 miles from Lake Balaton, I entered the gigantic cloud bank. What happened next, I shall never forget. In a flash, we were swallowed up in pitch-black darkness. The outside temperature sank swiftly to freezing point. The rain lashed against the windscreen and reduced my visibility to nil. From now on, I had to rely on my blind flying instruments: artificial horizon, spirit level, altimeter compass, airspeed indicator, and variometer. To have a better view of the instruments, I lowered the seat and registered my entrance into the storm cloud on the instrument panel clock. My crew was now relying upon me, for they could do nothing. The deeper we penetrated the bad weather zone, the more the machine was buffeted by the strong wind. Time and time again I had to bring her back on an even keel. Then something happened which I have only once experienced in night flying. It was pitch black around us, and the lightning lit up the rain clouds. Then blue lights lashed against my windscreen, slowly at first and then in unbroken sequence. This blue harsh light outlined the whole machine from the wingtips over the engines to the armour-plated nose. A little blue flame appeared on the points of the aerials, and the propeller blades were clearly outlined with a blue circle of light. We were all terrified. I was so spellbound by this natural phenomenon that I could not take my eyes off the blue lights. The machine shuddered beneath the gusts of wind. I forced myself to watch my instruments, since to stall in this witch's cauldron would mean certain death, but the St. Elmo's fire kept catching my eye. My clock registered 7 flying minutes, so I must have passed the hub of the storm. Slowly the blue lights vanished. The gusts calmed down, and now only the rain lashed the white outlines of my me. 1:10. The radio operator called our airfield and was told that the weather was clear there. Grasshoff switched off his transmission and went onto the beam. The little pointer wobbled systematically from left to right, a sign that we were on the right course. Half an hour later, we landed at Szombathely. My pals had naturally been listening into our conversations during the ops and pulled my leg after I had reported to the CO. I gave him a completely accurate report and told him of my experience with the Mitchell. Oberleutnant Sepp Kraft shook his head and said woefully that such a thing could never have happened to him. A Mitchell was as easy to distinguish from a Doe 217 as a horse from an ox. "Probably in daylight, bright boy," I replied. A few days later, I was proved right. On the night of 26th June 1944, the British attacked the Hungarian capital from Italy. The bombers were already reported over the Adriatic when at 22:45 hours we took off from our airfield. North of Baja, and therefore a long way from the capital, we met the British bomber stream and decimated it. Only a few bombs fell on Budapest, causing a few poultry fires. Our wing shot down 16 of the enemy. During this attack, Oberleutnant Sepp Kraft shot down 2 bombers, a Vickers Wellington and a Mitchell. We were rather surprised. A Mitchell from Italy. It did not seem possible. The thick end of the stick came later. Budapest called and asked whether our fighters had shot down a Do 217 by mistake. There was an icy silence. The CO compared the time of the incident in the operational report with the time of the shooting down of the Dumba 217. It could only have been Kraft's Mitchell. The times agreed precisely, and also the site of the crash. Fortunately, the crew of 4 managed to escape from the burning machine, thus saving him from a court-martial. Kraft was depressed. I could not help indulging in a little malicious pleasure and said, "Well, old man, you mistook the ox for a horse." Once more it was a case of he who laughs last laughs loudest. Nevertheless, the success of that night cheered up both the pilot and the ground crews. The crisis was over. We were ready for new deeds. During the next ops, we were to lose one of our best pilots, Oberleutnant Wolfgang Knieling. Knieling, a magnificent night fighter, distinguished himself in particular in the Battle of Berlin. In an air combat over the German capital, he was hit by a flak burst. Badly wounded, he landed the heavily damaged machine with his last strength, saving the lives of his wounded wireless operator and gunner. On landing, he fainted through loss of blood. The ambulance was quickly on the spot and took him to hospital. After months on his sick bed, he returned to our wing. On his arrival, a telegram was waiting for him from home. His young wife had presented him with a daughter. He was thrilled. The sirens wailed at midnight. A British formation was flying over Croatia in the direction of Vienna. We scrambled for our machines and were airborne within a few minutes. Knieling hobbled to his dispersal pen on his gammy leg. The engines were revved up, and in a few minutes the wing was in the air in strength, 30 machines. It was a free-for-all. Each of us flew towards his own destiny. The British skimmed over the Alps in order to escape our radar. At this altitude, near the icy peaks, I spotted by chance a Vickers Wellington. It was 30 minutes after I had taken off. The Tommy must have seen me, for he streaked towards the mountains to shake me off. I knew that pursuit would be very dangerous, for each moment a rocky wall could loom ahead. But the British pilot gambled everything on one card and went down lower into the valley. On both sides of me, the mountains were now higher than my wings. Suddenly a huge column of flame rose ahead of me. The bomber must have crashed straight into a cliff. The flames lit up the neighbouring mountains. At the moment of his impact, I zoomed in order to escape a similar fate. The ground station gave me my position, Schneeberg, with a peak of 6,250 feet. This mountain had proved disastrous to the British crew. Strange, a kill without a round of ammunition having been fired. The pursuit went on. All round me burning machines were hurtling down into this world of ice. The ground station reported once more. Attack on St. Pölten in progress. 8 minutes later, we picked up a second Vickers Wellington in our radar. The bomber was flying peacefully towards its target and was not far away. The bombs were still in its bays. I attacked immediately and fired with all my guns into the fuselage. The British bomber stream was broken up before it reached Sankt Pölten, and its bombs fell at random on the city. On the return journey, I had no luck. The Tommies, impressed by their losses, hedge-hopped for home. Oberleutnant Knieling was pursuing one of them. A bitter combat developed above the mountain peaks. Knieling sent his final message. "Park! Park!" I, too, was watching the exchange of fire, not far ahead. The British pilot replied with tracers. The bursts crossed each other. A short pause and another burst. The Tommy struggled desperately. Knieling gave him no quarter and sprayed him with a rain of fire. Suddenly both machines were on fire. The bomber went down in a power dive and crashed. Knieling remained with his machine on fire for a while in the air, then crashed quite close to his quarry. I circled over the spot, but there was no hope. The burning wreckage lay at 6,000 feet in a world of ice and snow. After the attack on Sankt Pölten, calm reigned in the air by night. Had the losses been too heavy for the Allies, or were they preparing a new offensive? The latter must have been true. There was great activity in Warsaw, where the small German garrison was faced with strong forces of Polish partisans. A revolt could break out at any moment, but the partisans were in need of weapons and ammunition. But how were they to get them? The overland route was closed, and they could only be brought in by air. The British prepared a big airlift from Foggia to Warsaw. Formations of Halifaxes and Lancasters were sent from the British Isles to Italy. Preparations were underway, but weeks elapsed before this airlift started. The Luftwaffe command had known this, and so transferred some of the crews to the west. I was among them and left on 17 July 1944 for St. Trond in Belgium. The flight was from Hungary over Austria and Germany and took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Here was stationed the night fighter wing commanded by Hauptmann Schnaufer, the ace of the German night fighter arm. After Oberleutnant Lent, Hauptmann Schnaufer was the second night fighter pilot to win the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, just about the time that Lent and his crew were killed in such tragic circumstances. Schnaufer was considered by the English bomber crews as their worst bogey. At that time they called him the Spook of St. Trond. Night after night they sent special crews in mosquitoes to put an end to his activities. Before the British bombers left the British Isles, these mosquito formations left for St. Trond to sow chaos among the Schnaufer wing by low-level attacks on their grounded aircraft. But the stout Swabian always managed to lead the Tommies by the nose. He was always the first to take off and pursue the bombers on their run-in. His crew was infected by his youthful energy and courage, which had raised the number of kills in No. 4 Night Fighter Group No. 1 to more than 700. His go-getting energy together with great flying skill and cunning led to successes that were unsurpassed in the history of the Second World War. Schnaufer never spared himself. Thus he took off one night alone when a thick fog had reduced visibility to nil. His audacity paid dividends, for he shot down 4 British bombers. He had a unique success during a raid on Stuttgart. A bomber stream in close formation flew over the Swabian capital. Schnaufer inveigled his way into the stream, sending one bomber after the other into the depths. He was soon up with the leaders. Just before reaching Stuttgart, a machine broke away from the stream. It was the master of ceremonies. Schnaufer's wireless operator picked up the machine in his radar. Schnaufer knew that on the success of this combat depended the life of his crew, the life of many of the Stuttgarters, and the life of the city itself. He decided to attack, but it took him a long time to close in. There was a smile on his face. He knew what he was up against for a master of ceremonies was something in the nature of an impregnable fortress. The most carefully chosen gunners sat in these bombers to give their wing leader an undisturbed approach flight to the target. The best radio operators watched the air with special radar apparatus. No surprise attack was possible against these crews. Long before the night fighter came out of the dark, they had spotted him. They knew his direction, speed, and altitude within a few seconds. The smallest change of course did not escape the English radar operators, who immediately notified the experienced gunners. Schnaufer knew all this, but his ambition did not allow him to hesitate. The Tommy must be brought down. His operator kept giving him the distance. The approach went according to plan, for the Britisher was cruising peacefully. Distance 900, 800, 700 yards, aircraft at one altitude directly ahead. Now even our cool-headed Schnaufer was excited. 600, 500, 400, courier straight ahead. Schnaufer removed the safety catch, and his right thumb was now on the firing button. He knew that by now the Britishers' guns were probably trained on him. Distance 300, 200, 150 yards. The operator had hardly given this last report than the crew went nearly crazy with terror. Dazzling flare bombs lit up the machine as bright as day. A piece of shrapnel went through the cabin and tore the radar out of the wireless operator's hands. Schnaufer reacted as quick as lightning and broke away. This saved his life. The tracers streaked away over the cabin, but the Britisher had shown his teeth. Slowly the pilot ran his hand over his eyes to banish the blindness caused by the flash bombs. His eyes grew accustomed to the darkness once more. The master of ceremonies must still be very close, and at any second the storm could break again. "What a bloody business," said Schnaufer into the RT. "What are we going to do without our radar? Good thing he's flying on a steady course. Perhaps we'll still spot him." The seconds passed. A slipstream caught his machine and flung it downwards like a scrap of paper. Schnaufer righted her immediately, pushed the throttle full home, and suddenly saw his opponent's slender fuselage and broad wings loom out of the darkness. But how should he attack? Schnaufer dived until the outlines of the bomber could be seen only vaguely against the sky. Now he must make the decisive attack from below. He pulled the nose of the machine up and zoomed like an arrow at the bomber. But the latter had been watching and met him once more with a confetti rain of tracers. The iron nerves and the cool judgment of this wing commander came to his aid. He flew for 2 seconds into the defence fire before he fired his cannon. The master of ceremonies exploded in the air, a giant Catherine wheel. Burning fragments fell on Schnaufer's machine, setting the starboard engine on fire. He was surrounded by a bright firework display of flash bombs, green, red and yellow rockets, and bright parachute flares swaying slowly earthwards. His engine was still on fire. To prevent the worst, he had to close the firecock and stop the engine. Fortunately, no British night fighter was in the vicinity, or he would have been doomed. The parachute flares drifted slowly to the ground, where the wreckage of the Master of Ceremonies aircraft was still blazing. The site of the kill was just southwest of Stuttgart. Schnaufer now found himself in the middle of the bomber stream, which was making for the false marker flares. About 400 British bombers dropped their load in open country. A smile appeared on Schnaufer's face. In this welter of bombers, a gigantic black shadow suddenly shot above the cockpit of the damaged night fighter. The gunner, who was on the alert, caught the enemy machine in his sights and blazed away with the machine guns until the barrels were hot. He was successful. The petrol tanks caught fire, and the bomber dived earthwards in flames. "Nice work, Wilhelm," said Schnaufer on the RT, as he congratulated his stout gunner. "But now we'll take a powder before the night fighters spot us. We can't afford any larks with only one engine." The wing commander put his machine into a steep dive, and an hour later the victorious crew landed at St. Trond. Obituary. Later, as a good Swabian, Schnaufer, on a cold February night in 1945, continued his efforts. Taking off from Gütersloh, the major, who in the meantime had been promoted Group Commodore and awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, shot down 7 4-engined bombers within 90 minutes, a unique achievement in the history of German night fighters. In further bitter combats, he and his crew raised their total victories to 126. At the end of the war, the British transported Schnaufer's crack machine to England. The Londoners were able to admire the Mima 110 in Hyde Park. Shaking their heads, they counted the bars representing kills on the tail unit. 124. 126. They would have liked to bring the spook of St. Trond to London, but Schnaufer lay in the hospital and had no wish to be stared at by the Londoners in Hyde Park. After the war, he came to a tragic end. To the delight of his mother, he took over the family wholesale wine business in his hometown, Carlow, with the same energy as he had shown during the war. This war pilot, who had survived 1,000 dangers, lost his life on a business trip through France. He was driving his car along a perfectly straight road through a forest when a truck turned out of a side road. Schnaufer used his brakes, skidded, and the two vehicles collided. Without regaining consciousness, the ace of the German night fighters in the Second World War died of his injuries far from home. Important personalities in the German night fighter arm. General Josef Kammhuber set up the 1st Night Fighter Division in 1940 and introduced new night fighter tactics. In 1943 he commanded Wointhi, Fliegerkorps, and became Inspector of Night Fighters. A disagreement with Luftwaffe High Command regarding the correct night fighting measures led to his transfer to Air Fleet 5 in Norway. He was awarded the Knight's Cross on 9th of July 1940 with the rank of General Major. I had no luck at St. Trond, 2 ops and no kills, but I was soon sent back to Hungary. It had been quiet there during my absence. No particular incidents except the surprising news that our CO, Poldi Fellerer, had married a pretty Hungarian. We celebrated until late into the night and kept drinking to the health of the young couple. That evening, Poldi took me to one side and told me that I was to be given my own command, a squadron that had been increased in strength. The divisional order would be coming through at any moment. It arrived next day. My new squadron was transferred to Novi Sad near Belgrade. My task? To interfere with the British airlift from Italy to Warsaw. At the age of 22, I had to take full responsibility for all my orders and enforce the regulations. The ground staff went on ahead with the trucks. A commando prepared our quarters and took care of the technical installations. I took off in formation with 12 night fighters for my new airfield on 28th of July 1944. We flew low over the Blue Lake Balaton and veered off eastwards to the Danube. After crossing the river, we turned on a southerly course, and now, below us, lay the endless Puszta. Occasionally we roared over a village, and the peasants looked up in terror as though a storm had suddenly broke. Although the Puszta is a desert, it has its own particular charm. A few small lakes and moors, and then endless brown steppe. An occasional, almost biblical well-heralded another village. The sun beat down pitilessly on the flat country, parching the earth. It was even hot in our cockpits. Towards the south, green fields and extensive cultivation appeared. We flew over the Batschka, a German minority region. Here the villages were larger and more beautiful, and the fields better cultivated. Dipping our wings, we greeted our landsmen. They waved bright cloths to us and threw their hats in the air. After 70 minutes' flight, a small chain of hills appeared on the horizon, the Fruška Gora. Here the Danube bends eastwards towards Romania. Novi Sad lies just south of the mountain chain. I made a wide sweep and broke formation. We landed at short intervals and parked our machines in front of the small hangars. My adjutant, Oberleutnant Schuleit, who had been in charge of the commando, came up with a smile and gave me his report. Everything was in order. Our quarters were ready, and a shed had been cleared for use as a workshop. Mess, headquarters, recreation rooms and huts. Schuleit had organised this in the shortest possible time and satisfied all our demands. The Hungarians were very polite and took a lot of trouble to gratify our wishes. Schuleit was a splendid negotiator. The conversations were in broken German and a terrible mixture of other languages. But even when the Hungarian liaison officer came to the end of his knowledge of German and began to gesticulate in his mother tongue, Schuleit kept saying benignly, "Igen, Igen," as though he had understood. Schuleit was known as Igen. He had done a good job, and late that evening I could report to the divisional commander that we were ready for ops. The July nights in Hungary are very hot. We lay in deck chairs outside headquarters at the edge of the airfield, waiting for divisional orders. I assembled the crews and told them of our duties. I took the precaution of detailing 2 waves to fight the British supply machines. The first wave was to attack them on the flight to Warsaw, and the second on the return trip to Foggia. As emergency landing strips, we had Budapest, Belgrade and Sombor at our disposal. We had to fly over partisan country. In view of this, each crew took a Tommy gun and provisions for 3 days. Furthermore, on a forced landing in partisan zones, all uniforms had to be destroyed. Otherwise, there was no chance of the men ever getting back to their own lines alive. The crews made their preparations. My fighter controlling officer, Oberfeldwebel Kramer, reported that the runway was ready for landing and, to give stress to his words, proudly turned on the obstacle, boundary and flare path lights. Everything was improvised, and it seemed as though a magician had been at work. I ordered everyone to headquarters so that we could inspect the airfield with its night illuminations. Kramer gave the necessary orders for starting and landing. There was only one runway, north to south. The east-west axis was not long enough, and to take off towards the south was dangerous, for it was in the direction of the small mountain chain. To the north, the terrain was perfectly flat. It struck me that the artificial takeoff horizon in the west was lacking, and I pointed this out to Kramer. "Hell, Herr Hauptmann, I forgot it. But where can I conjure one up from? We've no cables, no lamps and no poles." However, Kramer, who in the old days had flown with the Lufthansa, knew how to organize things. In cooperation with Oberleutnant Egan, he laid on 20 wooden poles and petrol lamps. The men went out into the fields with spades and axes, planted the poles 30 feet apart, and slung the lamps on them. We now had a take-off horizon, even though these petrol lamps were rather difficult to see. But it was better than nothing. For the young crews, this artificial horizon was an important accessory on take-off. That evening we were admiring the glorious starry sky, as we had so often done before, when the telephone rang and 3 machines were ordered to their night fighting sectors. Presumably an English formation was on the way. Well, that was fine. I grabbed my revolver and hurried to the machine. Marley and Grasshoff were already aboard, fastening their parachutes. With the cockpit roof open, I taxied to the start, closed the roof, and was the first to take off for Sector Scorpion. The communication with my controller was okay, but shortly after takeoff, we received the order: return to base. The enemy formation had presumably turned for home. I preferred to think that it was a practice takeoff laid on by the division. So I said farewell to my controlling officer Schwartz, who was sitting somewhere in an abandoned nest in the Puster. He had built up the ground radar station Scorpion with a few soldiers from the signals service. I set my course for Novi Sad and began to lose height. From a long way off, I could recognize Kramer's ground lights and beacons. Making a wide sweep, I landed a bare 20 minutes after takeoff. The mechanics refueled my machine, and I had a chat with Kramer about improving the airfield lighting. The crews stood around watching their fellow pilots land. Oberleutnant Buder, who was fresh to a night-fighting squadron, came in, followed by Feldwebel Hubach. Both of them grinned as they reported back from ops and were duly chuffed by their companions. 30 minutes after landing, Division gave orders for 3 further machines to take off. The situation was as follows: English bomber formation over the Adriatic, flying a northeasterly course. This time it seemed to be the real thing. I took off once more with Buder and Hubach, and yet within half an hour we were recalled. "Rise, rise, rise, no aircraft in the air," came over the air. "Service, Earthworm, sleep well," I said to my fighter controller, and landed shortly after midnight on my airfield. As I entered the mess, I met a group of cheerful Hungarian officers. "Joe Estetriwano," I heard. "Come and drink with us to International Flying Good Fellowship." We celebrated until the following morning. Only as the sun rose did I lie down with a thick head on my bed. The following days were spent settling down in Novi Sad. Gradually, we grew accustomed to the peculiarities of the partisans. At first, we noticed the disappearance of the petrol lamps and that the artificial horizon grew ever smaller. Kramer cursed to himself, took a Tommy gun, and rushed with a few soldiers across the maize fields. In the distance, we could hear the sounds of firing. After half an hour, the horizon was repaired, and Kramer returned. "Why did you shoot, Kramer?" I asked him. "Herr Hauptmann, the fellows hide in the maize fields like moles. Do you think I'm going to let myself be shot down by a pack of bloody gypsies? I put the breeze up them, but the next time we'll take some hand grenades. That will make them sit up." I merely replied, "Again." That night, I took the new crews out on a practice flight. We had been flying barely an hour when the landing machines were fired on from the Fruska Gora. From my headquarters, I heard the clatter of a machine gun and took a bearing. I broke off the practice flight and ordered the machines to be examined. The mechanics found several bullets in the wings and fuselage, and in one case the main wireless cable was cut. I reflected for a moment on what was the best thing to do and took off in another machine to counterattack. We dived on the enemy positions with all our guns blazing. Silence reigned. There was no firing as we landed. Next evening, however, we were woken by a tremendous explosion. We grabbed our Tommy guns. What was up? Had one of the machines exploded? Fortunately, no. As a precautionary measure, I had placed a guard with a password on each of them. A soldier reported shortly afterward that a bridge had been blown up not far from the airfield. These guerrilla tactics continued every day. A flak company, felling trees for building their gun positions, was ambushed in a sunken road near the Fruska Gora and murdered. One man got away and reported the fate of his comrades later the same night. Thus, there was always some activity, if not in the air, on the ground. It was strange. By day, the sun seemed to shine on harmless peasants, busy at their fields and who bowed as we passed. A peaceful sight. But by night, hell was let loose and the partisans were in their element. Exactly 14 days after my arrival at Novi Sad, we had our first contact with the enemy. Shortly before midnight on 10th August 1944, Division reported the approach of a single enemy aircraft from the east, a Russian then. I took off with my crew for Sector Scorpion and called the ground station. Lieutenant Schwartz reported and said, "Wait." The Russian was still about 40 miles away, and it would be 10 minutes before he could be picked up by our radar. Obviously, it would be an aircraft of the type Mitchell B-25, a rapid, handy machine. The minutes passed. Schwartz led me on an easterly course towards the enemy. The distance soon decreased. Suddenly he ordered, "Left hand turn to course 260. I pulled my machine round and gave full throttle. My enemy was flying 2,000 yards ahead of me. We should have difficulty in catching him, for the Russian was flying at 260 mph and losing height. Slightly irritated, I gave Lieutenant Schwartz a rocket for not having put me on the course earlier. The Russian was already disappearing out of my SN2. I flew for another few minutes on the same course, making wide circles. Then something happened below. An airfield lit up. It was obviously in the notorious partisan area, for its lights showed a gigantic red Soviet star. A few white lights served to help the pilot land. I throttled down my engine so as not to make myself conspicuous, for now I must wait until the machine took off again. Half an hour passed. The supply plane, which had brought weapons and munitions, would take back a load of pork and wheat. After an hour, the ground station reported that the Mitchell was on the return flight. The machine gained height and was flying at a speed of only 200 mph. I dived like a hawk from my superior altitude and soon caught him. The Russian had suspected nothing, for he did not imagine there would be any German night fighters in that god-forsaken region. I got on his tail and scrutinized the outlines of the Mitchell, which showed up clearly against the clear sky. I cast a swift glance at my firing control lights. All 6 of them flashed red. The attack began with a long burst in the left wing, which seemed to have little effect. The wing caught fire, but the flames went out after a few seconds. It was now flying slower, and I had difficulty in throttling back. His port engine failed. I stalked him cautiously, for the crew had now been warned and would sell their lives dearly. For this reason, I decided upon a seesaw attack, which would give the Russians a difficult target. From a slight superiority in height, I dived on the machine and slipped away through the slipstream of the Mitchell to port. At that moment, I opened the second attack and fired a burst at the enemy's cockpit. The Russian crew replied with a murderous defensive fire, framing me with tracers. Tuck, tuck, tuck. The bullets hit my aircraft. I looked back at my crew to see that everything was in order. Grashoff replied, "Everything okay, Herr Hauptmann." My second attack was also successful, but the machine did not go down, although the left wing was on fire. The Russian gunner was now awaiting me from port. I dived rapidly below him onto his starboard side and attacked again. He had not been expecting this. A few seconds were enough to give him the coup de grace. Bright red flames lit up the dark night. But the machine continued on its easterly course. The rear gunner kept firing long bursts with his 4 machine guns. But his aim was inaccurate and the tracers did not find their mark. I could wait, and so flew away from the burning machine. The crew still had time to save their lives by bailing out. At each moment, the fire took a greater hold. Pieces flew off from the wings, and then the petrol tank exploded, lighting up the red star on the fuselage. With a gigantic tail of fire streaming from its right wing, it dived vertically towards the ground. Involuntarily, I dived after him to follow the crash. At that moment, the cool-headed rear gunner must have spotted me. From the doomed aircraft suddenly came a burst of fire which hissed past my wing. I had not expected this. Here was real self-sacrifice. In such a hopeless position, the crew should have bailed out if they set any value on their lives, but instead of this, they defended themselves desperately to the bitter end. A few seconds later, the machine crashed with all its crew. I respected these opponents. "Crazy fellows," said Mahler, sighing deeply, "and obstinate as mules. We gave them plenty of time to save their skins." Grashoff called the ground station. Schwarz replied and congratulated us on our first kill in Sector Scorpion. Then he said good night. After 2.5 hours, I roared over the illuminated airfield of Novi Sad and dipped my wings. This first success was the beginning of a long series achieved by my squadron. At midday on the following day, the telephone rang. Lieutenant Schwarz reported, "Congratulations, Herr Hauptmann. It was a fine show. Perhaps we'll spot another one tonight. You must come hunting in my sector more often." "Okay," I replied. "Call me in good time so that we can come to grips with the pirates." But things remained quiet until 15th August. That night something very curious happened. At about 21:30 hours, Lieutenant Schwarz reported a single machine flying in from the east, another partisan supply aircraft. I took off a quarter of an hour later and reported about 22 hours over Sector Scorpion. Schwarz and my radio operator got into communication, and the fighter controller immediately gave his first order. "Wait a little. The enemy is flying in." Some minutes passed before the second report came. "Enemy now flying in our sector at 9,000 feet, 40 miles away. Go up to 11,000 feet. I gained height and loaded my guns. My gunner Mahler reported, "Herr Hauptmann, today the first burst must be a winner. Those fellows get very irritable if we only tickle them up a bit." "If your guns are sighted properly, my dear Mahler, everything will be all right," I replied icily. Mahler was right. The first attack must succeed, or it would be another circus. "My guns are set at 80 yards, Mahler replied, defending his reputation. "At that distance, the trajectories of the 4 guns meet on the sights." "Then there'll be no cause for complaint," I replied. After this gratifying retort on the orders from the ground station, I set the machine on an easterly course towards the Russian. Distance 8 miles. Enemy approaching fast. Hardly had Schwartz given this order than I saw a bright light between the horizon and the earth. That cannot be a star, I thought. I observed as much to my crew. They all looked ahead and stared spellbound at this white spot which grew larger at every moment. It was, in actual fact, the enemy machine. Achtung, Achtung, Scorpion from White Thrush. Enemy sighted. Enemy flying with navigating lights. Victor, Victor, replied Scorpion. Enemy flying directly towards our position, 5 miles away. Victor, Victor, I replied. Park, park. I banked sharply and got on the tail of the enemy machine. This Russian was really irresponsible. Losing height, I soon caught him and flew alongside. It was unbelievable. The fellow was flying with his cockpit fully lit as though it were peacetime. What must the crew be thinking of? I figured it out in this way. In this peaceful sector, the Russian would never suspect the presence of a German night fighter. And why should he have done? A few ridiculous partisan supply aircraft were not worth a night fighter squadron, and the Hungarian flak, they had no respect for that. They were right, for their pathetic batteries would never prove a danger. The machine flew on undisturbed, and I could see the pilot at his controls. Without a care in the world, I accompanied my colleague from the other side and wondered what I should do now. It went against the grain to shoot that sitting target out of the sky. In the meanwhile, the ground station called, Achtung, Achtung, you're over our position. We can see him, we can see him. Good hunting. I should have preferred to let the enemy go. His lighted cockpit disturbed me so much, but my crew pestered me. Shoot him down. If we let him through, the partisans will get more Tommy guns, and our soldiers will pay the price. Yes, they were right. He must be brought down, but he must be allowed to defend himself. I looked once more at the pilot's seat and dived away. Then I took aim at the left wingtip from exactly 80 yards. A short burst from 2 cannon rang out. They registered a hit. A small fire flickered and went out immediately. They must have been warned, but nothing happened. The enemy pilot banked slightly but did not switch off his lights. I flew close to him and observed that the crew was having an excited discussion. Obviously they were wondering where the shots had come from. I fired another short burst, this time at his right wingtip. The same thing occurred. A small fire, which went out immediately. Now by rights the crew should have bailed out, for we could not go on much longer with this game. But after a few uncontrolled movements, the machine proceeded on its course. The lights were still on. Now I had to take things seriously, or we should have reached partisan country, and there was no point in letting the Russians bail out merely to increase their numbers. After these 2 warning shots in the wings, I could not hesitate any longer. Shoot them in the petrol tanks. The gentleman will be more comfortable bailing out, Grasshoff shouted angrily over the RT. But I was sorry for the crew, and I fired so that, if the machine crashed, the crew would be able to be saved. I flew close to my enemy. Hungry flames were already licking the starboard tank and lighting up my own machine. At last a man bailed out. I began to count. 1, 2, but the 2 stuck in my throat, for no one followed him. The machine stayed in the air for another few seconds, and then went into a vertical dive. The mystery was cleared up the next day. I learnt from Schwartz that the pilot who had bailed out, a Russian colonel, had been taken with a broken leg to Schomburg Hospital. I drove over to see him. The doctor gave me the first report. The Russian colonel had been given orders to fly a group of young cadets over the partisan route. To their surprise, they had been hit by flak. When the machine caught fire, the colonel was the only one who was able to bail out. I asked the doctor if I could speak to the colonel, and he gave me permission. I had a strange feeling as I opened the door of the ward. The Russian lay in bed staring into space and hardly vouchsafed me a look. I went over to him, laid a packet of cigars on his night table and shook his hand. He suddenly turned round, smiled and thanked me in broken German for my attention. His face seemed to say, "What is the reason for this friendly visit from a German officer?" Before I explained, I heard his account of the previous night's incident through an interpreter. The crew really had thought that they had been hit by Hungarian flak and had therefore not taken things seriously until the decisive moment came, which the colonel related as follows. I was rather excited by the hits on my wingtips and looked at the terrified faces of my cadets. The youngsters had no parachutes. So far we had carried out our flights without enemy attack, and parachutes are rare in Russia. I had difficulty in calming them, but they had a presentiment of the disaster and stared out into the darkness at the earth which lay thousands of feet below. I shall never forget the questioning look of the youngest, a fair-haired boy of hardly 18 who sat next to me in the cockpit. When another explosion made the machine shudder and the bright flames from the right wing dazzled us, he grabbed my thigh and stared at me in terror. But once more we were lucky. The fire went out and both engines were still running smoothly. I thought that the worst was over and wanted to light a cigar to encourage the youngsters. No more signs of the flak. My young neighbour breathed with relief and lit my cigar. At that moment there was a terrible crash. One of the boys shouted, "Fire! The starboard petrol tank's alight." What happened next was really a matter of seconds. Panic broke out on board. Some of them clawed the floor. I was almost crazy watching this tragedy and could hardly bear to abandon the machine. Then the flames licked the cabin and the acrid smoke enveloped us. The air was searing hot and the light went out. We flew on like this for a while, until the starboard engine fell out of the burning wing. The machine immediately dived earthwards. With my last remaining strength, I managed to get out of the burning hulk and only came to my senses when I landed heavily on the ground with my parachute. The colonel at these words looked at the plaster on his right leg and went on, "Yes, with parachutes we should all have been alive, for we had plenty of time." "Yes, you had time," I replied, "but do you know why?" The colonel shook his head. With the aid of their interpreter, I let him know that it was I who had shot him down, and not the Hungarian flak. I had given him and his crew plenty of opportunity to bail out by merely firing at his wingtips. The colonel understood. Tears ran down his cheeks. Now he could explain the riddle of the flak shots. He looked at me sadly and seemed to say, "You meant well, comrade." Suddenly he took my hand and pressed it. I was embarrassed and left the sick room without a word. In the town, I bought a bunch of flowers and gave a small Hungarian girl a pengo to deliver them to the Russian colonel in hospital. On 21st August 1944, 6 days after my meeting with the Russian colonel, I shot down my third Mitchell with its Russian crew after a bitter air combat. The Russian defended himself desperately, but my superior firing power finally turned the scales. After this, the partisans gave up their flights, but on the following night the British resumed their airlift to Warsaw. 22 August 1944, 24 hours. Division reported British bombers flying over the Adriatic on a northeasterly course. My crews were delighted. At last there would be an opportunity for some action. My kills had fired the ambitions of the younger pilots, and I had to calm them down as they hovered around, already in full flying kit. "Take it easy, boys," I said, "and keep your wits about you. Half the battle is to surprise the enemy." But it was difficult to keep them under control. They followed the path of the bomber stream, and when they were reported on the way to Belgrade, there were howls of delight. At last we received orders to take off. I took 6 machines, while 6 remained in reserve to attack the returning bombers. They flew directly over our air sector. Over the RT, I gave my crews their last orders and advice. My sector was the most southerly, and therefore the leading bombers would enter it first.